The median income is rising steadily. I mean, it's now above $50,000. So something good's happened to at least 50% of the people, and a lot of people moving closer to that. But I want to go back to the poverty question. Would you agree with this proposition that if people in the United States do just 3 things, if they get married and stay married, even if not on the first try, if they work full-time, even at a minimum wage job year-round, and if they complete high school, their chances of being poor are under 6%. In other words, there's 3 easy things you need to do to get out of poverty.
The 6% poverty rate would be very high for many countries. But when you look at how we explain poverty, there are generally 2 approaches. There's one to look for what are the individual characteristics, what are those individuals choosing that are making them poor. And the other approach is that it's a structural element, and that why is it that society is creating so many poor people? And the 2 groups rarely communicate with each other. And they'll yell at each other, but they'll never dialogue. When the fact of the matter that it's both, and it's very hard to separate out. So if you want to look at the problems of single parenthood or the lack of stable marriages and families, these are partly the result of bad choices, obviously, but it's also, these are socialized choices. These are social conditions. And if you look at the environments in which these communities are living, frequently they're reacting to the situation that is presented to them. They're making bad choices that if I made those bad choices, they wouldn't have a great impact. Whereas when they make a bad choice, the family gets decimated, because if a middle-class family gets divorced, it's not going to have the devastating impact because they have so many more resources to adjust to. Or if I get pulled over with drugs, there's less of the likelihood that I'm going to be put in jail and that it will have a devastating effect on me. Whereas if I'm a black man and if I look poor, not only will I be incarcerated, but that will have a huge impact on the family. The high rates of black male incarcerations is a significant contributor to black poverty rates in the United States, and for some reason it's not looked at as it, and most of it's for non-violent drug-related issues.
Thank you. I think time's up. Thanks.
I would now like to invite Mr. Novak again from his seat, to ask a couple questions for Mr. Storck for his response. Thomas, thank you.
Tom, I really love the distributist way of life. And I find a lot of Americans, maybe particularly from the Middle West, but also around universities, love the idea of retiring at 65 on a small farm, 5 to 10 acres, which they run for themselves, and they get a great satisfaction out of coping with nature and dealing with it. They find that a very restful, peaceful, contemplative. So I agree with you about the beauty of the ideal. But I want to ask you about how distributism would work in Nicaragua, in Togo, in China, in a lot of other places.
Oh, that's good, because those are even better places for it to work here. You're probably aware that one of the things that even some capitalist economists have focused on is the possibility of micro businesses in such countries. And Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist, wrote some things on this. And he complained that for various reasons, it was very difficult for small businesses to become set up and legally established and so on in these countries. These countries offer actually a more fertile field for establishing distributism than the United States, because their economies in some ways are more fluid. Costa Rica, for example, has an extremely distributist economy right now. Costa Rica, as some of you may or may not know, is one of the more stable Central American countries for a lot of reasons. It has a more homogeneous population and doesn't have the terrible inequalities of wealth. And it has a lot of small businesses. I don't have the figures with me, but it was an amazing amount of economic activity in Costa Rica that is being done by small businesses. So it seems to me that places like China, and especially the Latin American countries you mentioned, or African countries, would be perfect examples of distributism, where you could have very small businesses. Often the industrial processes in those countries are such that they would be a single proprietor would be much more able to supply a particular need without a lot of machinery, without a lot of capital necessary to set it up. So, gee, I think those would be excellent places to start distributism, and maybe we could go together and start it there.
Well, you know, in general, land reform programs in this country are inadequate because people don't want to live on the land in small groups. I mean, the enormous outflow of people from the distributist farms, 3, 4, 5 acres, you can sustain life, but you can't improve life. They're flowing to the cities of Latin America by the millions, huge, huge cities. But I wanted to, rather than continue down that road, I wanted to ask you a different sort of question. How would we have pharmaceuticals? You know, my wife is on chemotherapy for the 3rd year, and the kind of chemotherapy she needs didn't even exist 5 years ago. And it's very expensive. We couldn't afford it, but we do have Medicare. And that covers a huge chunk of it, and we have a supplementary policy that pays a good chunk of the rest. But it's rather the invention of that kind of chemotherapy that keeps her alive. And I myself have a much more modest heart problem, but I need certain medicines to keep alive. And I don't think a distributist economy would have the resources to put the research in to produce those things.
Let me preface this just by pointing out there was a lot of negative reaction a few minutes ago when Professor Clark mentioned the Canadian healthcare system. But you'll notice that Mr. Novak just gave a ringing endorsement for a Canadian-type system limited to older people, mentioning that he and his wife are on Medicare and therefore they're able to afford the drugs. Just keep that in mind, please. But in answer to your question, there's absolutely no reason why research has to be done by these huge companies. I mentioned before the occupational groups that would be a characteristic of a distributist economy. And suppose you had an occupational group of druggists. They could set up research institutes. They could fund research. As a matter of fact, a lot of pharmaceutical research is done by the United States government, not by private companies. And then this research is often used by private companies for their own profit. But the question, just because you need research, just because you need capital, it doesn't follow that the capital has to be owned and controlled by X group, and the research has to be done by X group. It can be done by lots of kinds of groups. We're not limited to a choice between a poverty-stricken way of life and a competitive commercial way of life. There are many, many other alternatives, many arrangements. I mean, human ingenuity can come up with all kinds of things. And so the one that I would think would be most characteristic of the distributist economy is for these occupational groups to fund all kinds of institutions that currently are funded either by the government or by private business. And they would be funded, they could still do the same kind of research, they could still do the same kind of activities, but they would aim to enrich the whole industry and thereby serve the common good, serve the public. For example, suppose that you had an occupational group for the druggists, a guild for the druggists, and they had a research institute that they funded, and they came up with a particular discovery of a new medicine. Well, okay, that discovery would be made available to the members of the guild, because the purpose is, after all, I hope, to serve the public, and not just to restrict it as much as possible. So the guild can make it available to its members, charge a fair price for it, sure, get a return on their investment, of course. All that is understood. But it doesn't have to be done by large pharmaceutical companies.